Honk.
Howdy, I'm Yoon Holly. I write science fiction, which is really all you really need to know. I am back with Aggro Goose in order to reduce the amount of cuss words in this. Today, what I would like to discuss, following on from military science fiction and just generalized Aggro Goose opinions, is Mimesis, for good or ill. This is something I learned about when I was hanging about the text adventure / interactive fiction community in the aughts when I was a grad student avoiding my homework, as one does. And also, not just mimesis, but the difference between, let's call them fictive complaints, not to say that people don't actually feel the way they do, but sometimes, at least from the standpoint of a writer or someone else who is creating a narrative experience, what readers or the audience, I'm going to shorten this to readers, what readers say they want is not actually what they quote-unquote want you to deliver in terms of, coming back for more. I'm going to start with the fictive complaint piece because I can't think of a better term for it. I really first started thinking about this more cohesively when I ran through a course on serialized fiction, which of course has different structural requirements than a standalone novel or even a trilogy, because often a serialized novel is meant to be binge read. It's meant to encourage you to keep buying that next episode. Some of them are more open-ended, although they may have, a season arc. One of the things she talked about was that in this format, what she had found to work very well was the cliffhanger. And of course, a lot of people will complain about cliffhangers. You put a cliffhanger at the end of book 1 of a trilogy, you put a cliffhanger at the end of book 2 of the trilogy. Maybe if you put one at the end of book 3, people are probably going to scream, even if they didn't scream about books 1 or 2. The anecdote she related, which I found super interesting because I had not thought about it that way, was, again, with the serialized thriller, I don't remember whether it was this one or a later one that got picked up for a TV show. There would be this reader, and of course, Alana, having learned that this is what works for her audience, would end every chapter, every episode of, probably 1,000 to 1,500 words. I think on Radish, but I don't remember the platform exactly. At the end of these chapters, it would always end in a cliffhanger, and this one specific reader would would read that episode, get to the cliffhanger, leave a comment to the tune of, "I can't believe you ended in another stinking cliffhanger. I hate you. This is horrible. You're a terrible author." I mean, maybe not that extreme, or maybe more extreme. Maybe she was watering it down in her account. But the thing is, she drops another episode. Reader comes back, reads through the episode, having bought the episode, reads through the episode, and then leaves the exact same comment because there is another cliffhanger. So Alana's point was that maybe this would be really upsetting at first, but also the reader is coming back for more. They may find the experience of a cliffhanger frustrating or unpleasant, which probably should be the topic of another Aggro Goose opinion piece. But it's that frustration in wanting some kind of resolution that keeps the reader, or that reader anyway, coming back for more. If the author stopped doing the cliffhangers, I think there's probably a very high chance that the reader would no longer be as engaged. And the engagement might be expressed in what feels like a complaint fashion. Maybe it actually is a complaint. Again, we're talking about the generative use of frustration as a narrative device. Frustration of what the reader wants. You're stringing the reader along. You are stringing along the reader who keeps hoping for XYZ thing that they really want to happen. This is one example of the kind of complaint that readers may make that is not necessarily indicative of, quote-unquote, what they really want in terms of what would keep them coming back. Again, I don't really want to talk that much about quote-unquote literary quality because that is a vexed question. I'm really at what can we empirically see, especially in a serial, is are they buying the next episode or not? Are they clicking through, if it's free, are they clicking through to that next episode, next chapter? Are they turning the page? These are things that you can observe, or you can sort of get some kind of proxy for it in a more quantifiable, observable way versus, does this have a literary quality? I'm sure I wouldn't know. I have a math degree. I'm not a literature major, so I don't think I really have a useful opinion on that matter. But of course, there are other kinds of complaints that may or may not be fictive in the sense of how distressed are the fans really. And I want to talk again, going back to the mention at the beginning, about mimesis, about realism or plausibility. I say, as someone who reads and occasionally writes for comics, superhero comics are one area where people will endlessly debate, Cyclops from X-Men, they are not actually laser eye beams, which was certainly news to me from the very, very little exposure I had from high school in South Korea. World-building inconsistencies or perceived inconsistencies, because sometimes the two are not the same. We want to think about mimesis as a choice. And what I mean by that is that mimesis is, in some sense, a stylistic choice. It is a fashion choice. Sometimes you have a narrative, especially from other traditions or quote-unquote older traditions, and you may look at a given tradition and it does not have mimesis, the realism, the how plausible is this really, as one of the core values, core aesthetic values of that narrative. And I think I would look here at allegory, for example. Edmund Spenser's giant poem, The Fairy Queen. I'm pretty sure, if I'm recalling correctly, he wrote that as essentially, Queen Elizabeth I, I guess. Queen Elizabeth, please give me a job or a patronage or something, because the entire praise to the Fairy Queen is, of course, a not very veiled, complimentary, flattering portrait of Queen Elizabeth herself. So there is that angle. But also, when you have characters with names like the Red Cross Knight, oh gosh, that must be St. George. Couldn't think of where else you would see a red cross on a knight. Or you have, I think, the woman who attempts to seduce or distract him. Look, I was a teenager when I read this, so I'm sure all the innuendo went straight over my head. You have the seductress or the fallen woman or the villainess in at least one of the sections, and her name is Duessa. She is two-faced. She is duplicitous. The point being here that these are not characters who are intended to be read as naturalistic portraits of humans, like actual humans. I mean, we could have a debate about the extent to which Superman or Batman or Wonder Woman or Jean Grey are quote-unquote naturalistic humans, and what are our criteria for naturalism. A narrative may not have mimesis as a core aesthetic value, or it may value mimesis in one area and less so in another. For example, I want to talk briefly about racing games, like car vroom vroom racing games for video games. I have terrible reflexes. I don't really play these, but my sense is that players of those games probably don't really care that much about granular representation of traffic case law in Miami. They probably care a lot more about, do the vroom noises feel real, or do they feel hyper real? Do they amp me up into this game? I may get a comment from someone who does sound design or likes racing games about how this is very inaccurate. People care about quote-unquote realism more in certain dimensions than in others. Look, so for example, your fantasy RPG, your computer RPG video game, for example, if it's meant to be medievaloid, and I use that term advisedly, if it's meant to be medievaloid, people will be okay with even kind of janky versions of arms and armor, especially since a lot of gamers, what they know about medieval arms and armor comes from Dungeons and Dragons. I would not be implicating myself. On the other hand, if you put a ray gun in there will be a complaint. Or to name something that actually existed, you're in medieval Europe and you include a hwacha, which is the Korean it's sort of a precursor to an artillery cart, which is you have these fire arrows, and I think there's like 100 of them, and then you launch them all at once off this essentially siege engine-like apparatus. But I think that was pretty specifically Korean warfare technology, so having it show up in 1098 in what is now France would probably be super weird and immersion breaking. When I talk about the Mimesis, I want to talk about how a lot of Mimesis, what counts as realism and what we discount in the realm of realism, is often based on unspoken conventions, or maybe they're spoken and I'm not hanging out in the right venues. Going back to the Medievaloid, let's take a Medievaloid TV show. What are the last ones I watched? I'm still making my way through Game of Thrones after everyone else has already moved on. Things like Legend of the Seeker, and certainly I have been that viewer, I've been that reader who's like, okay, this is Medievaloid vaguely modeled off Europe, so it's real interesting that y'all are eating all this potatoes, right? Or you might look at something that is set in the North American continent before Europeans come over, and there are horses all over, and my vague understanding, which is probably out of date, is that there were primordial horses like Eohippus and so on the North American continent, and then for reasons unknown they died out. When, for example, the conquistadors come over, they bring horses with them. The wild herds of Mustangs were not there previous to their being brought. Again, I have been that viewer, I have been that reader. Sometimes my husband is that person. I think he really likes fantasy better because he's a physicist, so he notices physics discrepancies more than I do, as not a physicist. And this wasn't actually a discrepancy, but I think it was dark matter where, they're going along in their starship and there's this one shot of a glorious nebula, and I'm like, fine, they pasted in a nebula because we're supposed to be in space. My husband pauses. He insists on pausing I say television, we really watch everything on a computer. He pauses this until he can run down the ID of the freaking nebula, and it might have been something really well known to an astrophysicist like the Crab Nebula. I feel like I would have recognized Horsehead, but it was something that there are commonly known Hubble telescope type photos, and someone who is an MIT astrophysicist probably does have that somewhere memorized or recognizes it well enough to know that they pasted in an actual thing instead of making up a nebula in Photoshop. But going back to the Medievaloid setting, to something like Game of Thrones, certainly, who is it, Bret Devereau, the military historian, whose name I hope I did not butcher too badly on, and he often deconstructs notions of quote-unquote medievalness, Medievaloid fantasy world building in video games and in TV, in film. But what I want to talk about is we can have those discussions about, gosh, agriculture and animal husbandry probably should have adapted around the fact that the seasons in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, of A Game of Thrones, go on for a very long time compared to what we think of as Earth normal. You can see complaints about, for example, if you see King's Landing, and I think Bret Devereau pointed this out, you basically have a giant lawn around there, and it's like, where are the shepherds? Where are the crops? Where are the people? That land would be in use is what he was getting at. And certainly I don't contest that. Or the one he also pointed out that I think is the funniest, because it's so true, is the entire bit where they call up all their vassals. We are having a sub-infeudation, I guess. They call up all their vassals and all the households, I guess, or the families, or the minor lords possibly, I don't remember details, who are sworn to the Lannisters. And of course they all show up in essentially uniform. And it's like, who provided all this finely dyed red cloth, tailored to each individual so that everyone is showing up as though we had a standing professional army, which does not look like is what is going on. One of the complaints I don't generally see about Medievaloid TV fantasy, because at least in the United States, among my admittedly anecdotal circle of friends, because we have a convention that this is quote-unquote something that doesn't matter in mimesis, in quote-unquote realism, something that doesn't matter for purposes of this kind of joyous, fanish nitpickery as a reader or audiences. Why does everyone have such good teeth? Especially if you read like a tiny bit of anthropology, which is certainly all the anthropology I've ever read. Dental care does not... You see a lot of anthropology stuff around people's teeth, I guess the whole dental record thing. But you'll see the anthropologists discussing how you can see patterns of wear depending on what people are eating. The point being, I tend not to believe that everyone in a medievaloid world that doesn't have, lots of high magic healing type stuff floating around, I don't think everyone's going to have a perfect Hollywood smile. And the thing is, we just sort of generally agree that this is an area where mimesis really doesn't matter. Listen, I am a gigantic wimp, which is why I held off on watching Game of Thrones. And when I say watching, I mean half the time I'm looking away from the screen because I am extremely squeamish and I am a gigantic wimp. I literally sit there chanting, it's just ketchup, it's just ketchup. I feel weirdly reassured when the special effects of people doing dangerous things or dying or, being mauled. I feel better when I can tell it's acted or special effects or some choreography trick or it looks slightly fake because I know no one's really getting hurt. So this is my idiosyncrasy. In the interest of actors not actually hopefully being in physical danger more than I guess what is typical for the profession, I'm okay with things looking kind of fake if it means it's done in a safer way. We are winding around very meanderingly to military science fiction, which was the original ask, which is, again, in military science fiction, which is my area of knowledge, and probably also in military fiction generally, certain sectors or certain topics tend to be treated with a higher level of attention to mimesis, or there will be consistency around a high or low level of mimesis. And by low, I mean you could have the thing where it is a little more super heroic. It is a little more everyone is hyper competent and has the best elite gear and they are all very good at what they do. They are all badasses. Versus, I talked to a friend of mine who used to be in the U.S. Army, is now a lawyer actually, and he said, it's always funny how in video games everyone thinks we are using this high-tech, 20 years into the future, super elite power armor stuff, and in real life it's 20-year-old, barely functional, held together with spit and baling wire equipment built by the lowest bidder as a contractor, because there are stories certainly that go that route. Again, notoriously, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, of course, takes this to a parodic extreme. At the same time, if the aesthetic is that we have the glitzy, high-tech, fancy, or something like Warframe, where everything is very high-tech, very glossy, versus the Catch-22 aesthetic, which they are both distinct aesthetics, again, without getting into literary quality, or film TV quality, or video game quality. I think they are narratively valid approaches. They certainly can be done better or worse for a given player or audience viewer's opinion, their reaction, because of course all of us value different things. In general, one of the hard problems with mimesis is that as an author, speaking for myself, most of us do not have 218 PhDs. I certainly do not have a single PhD, although I have 2 degrees, which do not generally come into play with most writing. You only have, say, 400 pages in a typical science fiction or fantasy novel. You can only be so expert at so many things if you're a normal human or a normal octopus alien from Andromeda. You can talk to experts, you can research things, But again, with the billionaire romance, listen, people who are reading a billionaire romance are not there because they're typically not there because they want to hear about forensic accounting practices or corporate governance bylaws, which, by the way, I don't understand any of this. I don't have a business or law background myself. But people reading a billionaire romance really want to read about luxury. They want that part of the fantasy. Whereas if you have something more like a legal thriller, a corporate espionage thriller, then in that case, it might make sense to dig into that specific area. Different genres will situate themselves differently in different areas of world building, in how allegorical they are, in how gritty and realistic they are, how elevated they are tonally. For example, a superhero played straight rather than deconstructed, that is kind of an elevated tone in terms of narrative, versus something like authors will have their biases about what is or is not significant in terms of world building, either because of personal inclination, you can always get me interested in siege warfare, or because of decisions that the author has made, consciously or unconsciously, about what is key for that story. And again, this could be like real realism, or this could be rigorous realism, or this could be a handshake agreement with the reader that we are all going to run on rule of cool, or it could be parody, or it could be absurdism, it could be a parody, it could be some kind of Oulipo literary experiment. So there are a lot of ways to situate oneself on this narratively, at least that I know of, in literary format, in prose format. And of course, the other thing that makes this difficult is that readers care about different things. Readers have different areas of expertise, and readers care about different areas of expertise. This may not be super common in people who read military science fiction. If you mess up standard Western tonal music theory, I will notice. I probably won't judge you too much, but I definitely will notice that there has been a goof. Whereas anything legal, I think my example here is Suits. I watch Suits, frankly, because of the witty banter and the very pretty people in pretty outfits. I do understand that Mike Ross, I think the main character, cheating his way into a law firm it appears to be highly non-likely based on the fact that every time I mention the show to a lawyer friend, their face melts off. Times in narrative, one of your limitations is that you're representing something that is more esoteric or that is a little more specialized, but you want to reach a wider audience. I'm going to give a TV example now, which is Numbers, the pilot episode. One of the main characters is this apparent genius wunderkind mathematician, sort of the kind of guy you would imagine getting a Fields Medal if the expected audience for that show knew anything about the Fields Medal. Essentially, there is no Nobel Prize for mathematics. The highest honor for mathematicians, as far as I understand it, is the Fields Medal. But of course, we're salty. I mean, not a mathematician, but someone with a lousy math BA. We're salty that no one has ever heard of it outside the math community. If we're talking about research mathematics that is that high level, something like Andrew Wildes's apparently very technical proof of Fermat's last theorem, I don't think I even understand the summary, but again, I only have a lousy BA. You're talking about a level of specialized endeavor that your average TV viewer probably does not have that expertise, especially mathematicians may not have that expertise if they're in a completely different area. I think I thought that pilot episode did really well in gesturing at the kind of math they want you to associate with this character whose superpower is math. I mean, I'm for that, while making the concept accessible to a likely non-mathematician audience, and also accessible in a way that does reflect people's misconceptions when they are thinking about math and statistics. I guess I am spoiling some of this, but essentially they are searching for some criminal using some kind of, I think, statistical analysis of where this criminal's activities have been reported. And so they're like, this seems really random. And of course, randomness is an area actually that humans generally are very bad at thinking about unless we have been trained to think about it. Even mathematicians, But what this mathematician points to is that he asks everyone in the room, I guess this is a bunch of police officers or detectives, something like that. Can you tell I don't watch very many procedurals? And he's like, okay, everyone just sort of put yourself in a random place in the room. And this helps because TV is a visual medium. We want to see the concepts if there have to be concepts. And this is very visual. We see all these police officers spread out across the room. And he says, now notice everyone, because we're humans, we have certain social conventions and grown-up ideas about polite ways to be, sometimes conscious, sometimes not conscious. Everyone is spaced out through the room. They are essentially distributed evenly. And he points out that this criminal, when you look at the map, all these quote-unquote random crime activities, I actually don't remember the nature of the crime activity, which is probably just as well, because have we mentioned that I am squeamish? All these crime activities on the map are evenly distributed. This is not random. In fact, in general, if you ask humans who are not statisticians or mathematicians, being Aggro Goose about it, if you ask humans to generate what they think is a random sequence of heads and tails, it will often look highly sus to someone who is familiar with how that works in probability and statistics. The point is that now that they know that this criminal is not going to random.org to generate coordinates for these crimes, they're able to use that information to catch the criminal. This is middle school math, but it's middle school math of a kind that humans generally, because we are not computers, humans generally, if we're not careful in our thinking, it is a kind of math misconception that is very common. Again, this is really not something you would expect to need a Fields Medal or even a math BA to understand this. This is something you can teach to elementary or middle schoolers to whatever extent. But that means it is very accessible and it can be illustrated in a visual format for that medium. So when you think about mimesis, I want you to think about, in my Aggro Goose opinion, because you actually don't have to care about what I think about in pragmatics, in narrative. You can do what pleases you. But one thing I would suggest thinking about is, where is the mimesis? What level is the mimesis? From as realistic as you can make it to completely hand-wave, not even consistent. Should we care? Why do we care? Why is it significant for the construction of this particular narrative? What is that level of the mimesis supposed to convey to the reader in terms of mood, in terms of theme, in terms of how we are supposed to react to the characters, how threatened we feel as readers on behalf of the world or its characters, on behalf of the plot? For example, a superhero thing where, what is it? It's just a flesh wound. You see them fall off a skyscraper and they land and it's fine. There's barely even a crater. We are going to feel less threatened, less concerned. We are going to feel that this is not a very high level of quote-unquote realism. I mean, that's probably vexed in comic verse terms, but so there are a lot of ways you can situate this, and frankly, people tend to disagree very strenuously over this in science fiction and fantasy. But I remind you of the fact that all these medievaloid TV shows usually feature people with really good teeth. So what do we care about? Why does it matter? That's all. Aggro Goose out.